Thank you for making the time to listen to the webinar. I hope this finds you safe and well, and let's get straight into it with the questions that we're trying to answer this evening. How will COVID change our market, and how should pharma companies adapt? Those are the questions we'd all like to know, of course, because in our industry it takes a very long time to develop new products and to change the organisations. So our industry, more than most others, needs to anticipate change rather than simply react to it. So everybody has an opinion on this question, of course, or multiple opinions on this question. But as a science-based industry, we really need science-based answers to these questions rather than guessing. And I spend my life doing this. I spend my life using evolutionary science to understand how our industry is evolving. That's what I do. So I'm going to take an evolutionary science-based view of how COVID will change our industry. In doing so, I'm going to try very hard to avoid simplistic, generic prescriptions. Instead, my aim is to show you how to think about the issue rather than what to think about the issue. There are some things that I won't even try to address today. In this webinar, I'm speaking to many companies operating in many different countries with very different products and very different sub-markets of the industry. So it would be silly to try and give operational tactical advice. Instead, I'm going to try and cover three things today in different levels of detail. I'm going to spend just 4 slides, I think, talking on the science behind the work that I do. It's not meant to be a lecture, but you do need to be familiar with just the basics to understand what I'm going to go on about. Then I'm going to spend 14 or 15 slides, I think, on what the science predicts regarding the medium and long-term impact of COVID on the pharmaceutical market. And then I'm going to spend 8 slides, I think, on the strategic implications of those changes for you and for your business. I'll talk for about 30-40 minutes, and then I'll go up to the top of the hour with questions. But if anybody wants to stay behind after that, I'll be delighted. So, although I began my career as a research chemist, I spent many years as a marketer in the industry. I'm now what they call a generalised Darwinist academic researcher. That means that I take ideas from Darwinian evolution and I apply them to the life sciences industry. That's possible because the biological environment and the business environment are the same sort of system. They're both complex adaptive systems, and Darwinian evolutionary science is the best science we have to explain that kind of system. You'll be familiar with this Darwinian process on the screen now. That's high school biology, and that explains the origin of the 8.4 million biological species that we have on our planet. But my work studies the application of the same process, the same Darwinian process, to the life sciences industry. So I look at the origin of business models and variation of business models in pharmaceuticals, medtech and related sectors. The two processes are the same in principle, exactly the same. They differ only in detail. In particular, the difference is that biological variation is supposed to be random, but business variation is supposed to be deliberate. In theory, however, we can choose the direction of our evolution. In practice, studies have shown that business variation is just as random as biological variation. That's because business decisions are often based on incomplete knowledge and are hindered by cognitive biases, so they tend to act as if they were random. So today I want to focus on this part of the process, how COVID changes our market environment and therefore selects for or against business models. And I'm especially interested in how it changes the selection pressures on pharma business models. So in my published work, which some of you will have read, some of you haven't, I describe 6 great shifts in the industry. These are large, long-term shifts that are already shaping industry. I'm not going to discuss these in any detail today because you've come to hear about COVID. But anything I say about COVID today applies on top of and in addition to these 6 powerful forces which are already selecting for and against everything our industry does and are transforming our industry. I'm not going to talk much more about the background science. I've written several books and hundreds of articles on the Darwinian evolution of our industry. If you want to discuss them, I'll be more than happy to do that offline. The question is, how will COVID change our market and our industry? Well, because our industry is a complex adaptive system, you can't predict its future with any precision beyond the short term. I think it was Maynard Keynes who famously said that economic forecasting only exists because it makes astrology look respectable. Okay? And if I said this is the future, then with any certainty, then you probably wouldn't believe me. But a good scientist is not the one who gives the right answers, he's the one who asks the right questions, as a famous philosopher once said. And in this case, the right question is, how will COVID change the selection pressures acting on the industry? Because understanding those will help us anticipate how our industry will change. And to understand how the industry selection pressures will change, then I need to talk just for a moment about complexity theory and butterflies. I'm sure you've all heard the story of a butterfly flapping its wings and causing a hurricane. But obviously on its own, a butterfly can't cause a storm. That's because the weather is not a simple system, it's a complex adaptive system. In a complex adaptive system, there is no simple cause and effect. Instead, a storm is caused by a complex interaction of many things, including that butterfly flapping its wings. Now, our industry is also a complex adaptive system, so what that means, in the same way, that COVID alone will not cause any major long-term changes to our industry. But its interaction with other factors will create the conditions for change. We call those conditions emergent properties because they emerge from the interaction of many parts of the system. The 6 great shifts that I mentioned earlier are emergent properties of the healthcare market. COVID will alter them, it'll amplify them, it'll accelerate them, but it won't change their broad direction. And those COVID-influenced emergent properties are the selection pressures which will shape our industry and our business models. So how can we understand them better? Well, without going into too much detail, there is a methodology for doing this known as emergent properties analysis. And it begins with systematically characterising the phenomenon, in this case COVID. Then it looks at the first order implications of the phenomenon. Then it looks at how these might interact to create second and higher order implications. And together, those second and higher order implications change the emergent properties of the system. And it's these changed emergent properties that are the selection pressures that either favour or disfavour traits of your business model, such as your strategy, your structure, your culture, and so on. So what happens then if we apply this methodology to the current situation, the COVID situation? Well, the information is incomplete and the situation is changing over time, of course, and the details vary between subsectors of the industry, such as vaccines or oncology, for example. But even with those caveats, we can begin to define the phenomenon that is COVID. The most important characteristics of COVID are already listed here. Importantly, the COVID situation is not just the clinical and scientific facts, but it's also the social and institutional aspects of the situation. We could write a million words here, of course, but no doubt the characterization will change and be improved as the pandemic progresses. But I think this is a reasonable summary of the main characteristics of the COVID situation. Our world has been hit by a pandemic that has been amplified by globalization and for which we were not well prepared and to which our responses have been inadequate and variable. If you accept that as a reasonable approximation of the COVID phenomenon, then we can use it to identify COVID's immediate first order implications. Many of the first order implications of COVID are already clear, although I suspect more of them will emerge as the pandemic has its full effect on countries with less developed healthcare systems. Again, I could elaborate, but this I think captures the essence. The key lesson to draw from this slide is that the implications of the COVID situation are very wide. They are technological, social, economic, political. And importantly, these implications are not separate, independent items. They're not orthogonal in the jargon. They interact and change each other in complex feedback loops. Our world, remember, is a complex adaptive system. And again, we could discuss this for hours, but I think this is a reasonable approximation of the first order implications of the COVID situation. And if so, it allows us to move on to the more complex question of what are the second order implications. The second order implications are harder to anticipate because they result from the complex interactions within the system. But I think even at this stage, careful use of emergent properties analysis can identify the most important of these second order implications. One is that healthcare costs will rise. That's because we'll no longer be able to treat public health and infectious diseases as a poor relation of acute care and non-communicable diseases, which is what we have done in the past. We'll need to maintain an inefficient and costly amount of slack in healthcare systems for contingencies like pandemics. And at the same time, politicians will no longer get votes for suppressing the wages of healthcare professionals who make up the large majority of healthcare costs. Another implication is that sooner rather than later, governments will try to reduce their huge debts, their huge World War II level debts. They'll adopt many fiscal and monetary approaches to do this. It'll vary between country, of course, but spending reduction, or at least tight spending control, will be part of this. And even while they're increasing spending on healthcare overall, they might look to make that extra spending as cost effective as possible. How exactly they'll do this will vary by payer system. As in all things, the US and Europe will do it differently, for example. But all governments will try one way or another to manage their debts and their healthcare costs. A third implication will be that priorities for healthcare spending will change. Some areas of healthcare spending will win, some will lose. The first winners are obvious, of course: antiviral drugs, perhaps antibiotic development, point-of-care diagnostics, vaccines, and so on. But where there are winners, there must be losers. Some I think are obvious: branded but undifferentiated products and treatments with unproven benefits will all come under extra scrutiny. But every area of spend will come under extra scrutiny, even more than at present. A fourth order implication is that healthcare policy will start to consider at least security of supply for important healthcare products. Now, I don't expect all countries to become self-sufficient in all areas of pharmaceuticals, but I do think that maintaining security of supply will become more important in the procurement processes. And once you start doing that, you have to start worrying about increased costs, of course. Security of supply will be much easier in large economic entities like the US, China and the EU. It'll be almost impossible for smaller countries such as post-Brexit UK, for example. The fifth implication will be that a shift in the relative attractiveness of different parts of the healthcare market. So we'll see the size and profitability of some areas increase and that of others decrease. But those changes will lead to new market entrants and new market exits, so competitive scenarios will change as well. In any case, all of those strategic portfolio management calculations you made in 2019 will definitely need to be reworked for 2021. A sixth implication is that we'll see a long-term shift in the way we work, especially with respect to personal interaction and international travel. I don't think for a moment that face-to-face interaction will stop, of course. We are social animals. But I think remote working will become much more common, both within companies and between organisations. And I think that large gatherings, such as congresses, will become much less attractive than they have been. But by no means least, all of these changes will prompt the emergence of a very wide range of new technologies, both those directly concerned with infectious diseases, but also others that impact indirectly on other areas of healthcare, like remote medicine. So, for example, we might predict that RNA vaccines, digital health technologies, AI-enhanced product development, smart drug delivery, all of those things will be given a boost in the post-COVID world. But importantly, new technologies rarely simply replace the old. Okay? Those of you who still have vinyl, as well as streaming, will understand this. Many old medicines and many old medicines will sit alongside more advanced successor technologies. This suggests that there will be a polarization between advanced and old technologies depending on buying power. Now, I won't pretend that this list of second-order implications is complete or perfect, and I certainly can't promise that I won't revise it in the future. But from where we stand now, I think it's a good place to build on. And it allows us to anticipate the emerging properties of the post-COVID market, properties that will act as selection pressures on your business models. And it's those selection pressures that I want to turn to next. There are two kinds of selection pressure: subset selection pressures and diversifying selection pressures. The first narrows diversity. It kills most of the population and leaves only one variant to multiply. So, for example, there were many kinds of early hominids with small brains, but these were all selected against by the environment to leave only one kind of big-brained hominid, Homo sapiens like you. The second type of selection pressure encourages diversity. For example, the 14 varieties of finch that Darwin discovered on the Galapagos Islands, they were all descended from a single species. Importantly, both subset and diversifying selection pressures act at the same time, and they act on the supply side of our industry, the organisations who are creating value, and the demand side, the people in the organisations who are seeking value. So a useful way of thinking about COVID selection pressures is to consider how these two different kinds of selection pressure act on each side of our industry. Let me begin with the most obvious conclusion, that the most important selection pressure will be for value creation. There'll be a subset selection pressure, not a diversifying pressure, as payers try to obtain more value for money, and technology allows them to do this, like data analytics and real-world evidence will allow them to do this better. Then the environment will select against firms that do not create economic value in the eyes of the customer. And as recent research has shown, many of our new drugs just do not do that at the moment. Of course, this isn't a new trend, but it will be greatly amplified and accelerated by COVID because the second-order implications I discussed earlier, such as government debt and reallocated healthcare spending, will increase the pressure. But there's a less obvious selection pressure for how value is created, and this is a diversifying selection pressure. Value is created by three kinds of innovation: either product innovation, or operations and supply chain innovation, or service and customization innovation. But we've known for decades that the most effective value creators are those firms that concentrate on being excellent at one of these three things and simply adequate or acceptable at the other two. So as demand for customer perceived value intensifies, this will create a selection pressure in favour of specialised firms and against firms that don't focus within their own value chain. And again, this isn't a totally new selection pressure. We already see research intensive companies, we see Me Too and generic companies, and we see companies that specialise in high added value services. But COVID will intensify this demand for value and the different ways to create value. So it will accelerate and amplify this polarisation. Both kinds of selection pressure for value creation will operate simultaneously. So together, they'll select for three kinds of business models. Business models that create value by product innovation, by service innovation, or by supply chain innovation, but they will select against business models that fail to focus and fail to create demonstrable customer perceived health economic value. In other words, there will be three broad categories of pharma business model in the future, all of which will be much more focused on value creation than today's models, and all of which will create better perceived health economic value than today's models do. So now let's look for a moment at how selection pressures will influence strategy in the demand side of our market, the people and organisations who are seeking value. Traditionally, our business has been focused on institutional payers such as governments and insurers. Markets where the patient pays out of their own pocket, aesthetics, OTC, health tourism, developing markets, have traditionally been less important for our industry. But the second order implications of COVID, overlaid on top of those 6 great shifts that I mentioned earlier, mean that the demand for healthcare will increase both in quantity and in quality. At the same time, governments and insurers' ability to meet that demand will increase only very slowly as they struggle to pay off their debts with a damaged economy that will be only slowly recovering. This will create a widening gap between the healthcare that is possible to buy and what governments and insurers can afford to buy. Patients and carers will fill this gap with their own money, as we've already seen in some sectors of the market. In the UK, for example, the King's Fund has predicted that in the future only 50% of healthcare spending will come from the government, compared to almost 90% at the moment. The increasing importance of the patient payer will create another diversifying selection pressure. The market will favour any business model that addresses the needs of people with money to spend, whether they are governments or insurers or patients. And because not all patients are equally able or willing to pay, that will create a diversifying selection pressure. The market will select for 3 kinds of commercial business models. Those that service government institutional payers, those that service affluent patient payers, those that service mass market poor patient payers. Obviously, we can point to some of this happening already. Some people already pay out of pocket, some even for very expensive treatments, co-pays and restrictions are increasing, but the economic, social and political implications of COVID will accelerate and amplify these already visible trends. So charities, crowdfunding, grandparent payers, all of these people will become more important. And when we put these supply side and these demand side selection pressures together, it will fragment the healthcare market into 9 distinct habitats. The 9 habitats will be very different from each other, and they'll be populated by very different business models. This has strategic implications for pharma companies, which I'm about to come on to. But there's one more point I want to address about the evolutionary impact of COVID on our industry. As I said, COVID will be additive to the 6 great shifts that are already happening. It won't change their direction, but it will accelerate them and amplify them to emphasize them. This means an even higher level of competitive intensity as firms seek to maximise their risk-adjusted return on investment in what will be a leaner and tighter market. Now, we know from biology that when evolutionary pressures intensify, species split and specialise. You see that in biology. You will all have seen this diagram before, or something like it. This is the tree of life, and it explains the 8.4 million forms of life on Earth. Now, evolutionary logic says that we should anticipate an analogous speciation event of business models in pharma. Now, I've spent 10 years now looking for the emergence of these diversifying business models, and my work points to no less than 26 different business models emerging in pharma and medtech. The equivalent diagram, the equivalent to the tree of life. Now, let me give you a moment to let that sink in. This is the future of the industry that we work in. Now, I'm not going to elaborate on this or explain them in any way. I can do that offline if you want me to, but you're here to talk about COVID. Well, the lesson I want you to take away is that your industry is going to get much more complicated and much more competitive. COVID will reinforce rather than change the evolution path of pharma, and that path is towards a mass extinction of old business models and mass speciation of new ones. This future complexity is illustrated even better in this figure, which shows exactly the same information, but in the form of a fitness landscape. If you've done any evolutionary biology, you'll be familiar with this. Each peak is a successful business model, and each trough represents many failed business models. To survive, you have to pick which model you want to be, which peak you want to climb. Then adapt how you create value and for whom you create value. And then if you do that, you will climb out of the trough and onto the peak. And if you don't, you'll slide into the trough and you won't survive. Now, that's all I intend to say about this evolutionary science as it applies to our industry. I'm very conscious it's a lot to take in, and I'm very happy to discuss it with you offline. But I promise that I will close by talking to you about the more immediate and practical strategic implications of COVID for you and for your companies. Obviously, the strategic implications will not be the same across the whole of our varied industry. Obviously, firms that directly address the COVID response are a subset, and I'm not going to discuss them. Nor am I going to cover the short-term operational issues, such as switching to remote meetings or the impact on field forces. What I want to cover is what's in that dark red box there, the strategic implications for businesses that are not directly involved in the COVID emergency response. And those implications lie at 3 levels of strategy. Corporate strategy, which concerns where to compete, business unit strategy, which concerns how to compete, and functional strategy, which concerns strategy execution. These 3 levels cascade into one another, of course, but they're usually the responsibility of different people in the organisation. And here I'm focusing on commercial aspects of the business model rather than R&D or manufacturing or supply chain, because that's my audience today. And my central point is that the 26 model COVID-driven direction of industry evolution that I've just described to you makes all 3 levels of strategy much more difficult. And the COVID-driven increase in competitive intensity will make it even more important that we get strategy right at every level. So starting with corporate level strategy. Corporate level strategy will no longer be about just choosing between therapy areas or specialities. It will now be about choosing between habitats and business models. And that choice, of course, is about comparing the risk-adjusted rate of return on possible models. The comparison depends on size, growth, competitive intensity, cost of entry, and of course, investment needed and the assets at risk. COVID changes every one of those factors. So compared to pre-COVID, any given market you might consider may be bigger or smaller, more or less profitable, more or less competitive, and it might require more or less investment at higher or lower risk. And the speciating landscape gives you more options to consider. That means that corporate level strategists, including people in M&A and business development, will need to understand the wider options and rework their calculations. To do that, they'll need to do a company-specific version of the emergent properties analysis that I discussed earlier. And they'll need to become more competent at assessing commercial level risks, which is something the life science companies have not historically been good at. Strategy at business unit level begins with a fitness peak decision made at corporate level. It's a business unit strategy is about deciding how to design a business model to climb the peak that's already been chosen. To do this, business leaders will have to become better at the fundamentals of competitive strategy, the 4 main fundamentals of competitive strategy: understanding the heterogeneity of the market, focusing resources where they can win and withdrawing from where they can't, designing value propositions to target segments that create distinctive demonstrable value, and delivering those complex value propositions cross-functionally. Business unit leaders will need to become excellent at these skills. But in many pharma businesses, the commercial functions are not well equipped to do this. That's because they've evolved principally to communicate and sell the product given to them by R&D, not so much to create value themselves. Their value creation capabilities, as opposed to their value communication capabilities, are often quite weak, especially if they've been used to having a unique product or a unique brand. Business units will have to evolve these capabilities or they won't survive. Finally, it's at the level of functional strategy where firms' adaptation to the new environment will succeed or fail. And here, the increased competitive intensity created by COVID and the speciating landscape will demand that commercial departments such as marketing, medical marketing and market access will become much more effective and efficient than they've needed to be in the past. Individuals in commercial will need to improve their technical competencies in their own disciplines. Within functions, this means both having the right processes and connecting those processes. Between functions, this will mean integrating processes vertically and horizontally. And none of this works unless firms manage to create a culture that encourages constructive conflict and reduces destructive conflict between functions. Taken together, these three levels of change may sound like a lot of stuff you've already been doing, and it may be that you and your organisation are adapting quickly and effectively. But I spend much of my time working with the leadership and commercial teams of pharma and medtech companies, and indeed I see a lot of people working very hard at adapting to the market. But after 20 years of working in the industry and then another 20 years of researching it, I'm concerned for the industry that I love so much. My fear is that COVID will accelerate the rate of market change to a rate that we're not used to and we're not equipped for. And although our industry is excellent at many things, evolving its business model at speed has not historically been one of those capabilities. So let me summarise what I've said today. Our industry is not a simple system, it's a complex adaptive system that can only be understood by evolutionary science. Our market is already evolving and COVID will have to accelerate and amplify that evolution. Our market will therefore become much more competitive and much more complex. To adapt to those changes, pharma is going to need to change and get better at three levels: corporate, business unit and functional level strategy. Pharma will need to change quickly and because of COVID, change more quickly than we're used to. But let me end on a positive note. A generation or two ago, if we wanted to change an organism like a cow or a dog, we could only do it very slowly by selective breeding. That's because we only understood the top of this diagram, the phenotypic traits. We didn't understand what lay underneath, but now we do, and we've learned we can change the phenotype by engineering the genome. The good news is that the same is now true in organizational evolution. In the last few years, we've learned what lies beneath this strategy and the structure. We don't need to let evolution take its course. We can understand now how to genetically engineer a pharma company for its new environment. It's not simple, it's not straightforward, it involves these things called organizational routines and organizational micro-foundations, but it is understood now. We don't have time to discuss this today, but if you'd like to know more about this, please talk to me offline. So in short, I compare COVID to that meteor that wiped out the dinosaurs. The direct impact was quite small. It killed very few dinosaurs. It was the aftermath, the implications of the impact that changed the world and wiped out the dinosaurs. But we are not dinosaurs. We are descendants of those tiny, intelligent, shrew-like mammals who replaced the dinosaurs. We are smart enough to drive our own evolution if we choose to do so. Thank you for listening.